Portrait of Governor Zamyatin. This is an 1865 painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov was 17 years old at the time. This was one of the first paintings he did. The painter was born in Krasnoyarsk, Siberia. That is east in the middle of Siberia. It is northeast of Kazakhstan. It is north of Mongolia. So how does a young, up-and-coming artist get his start in such a cold, remote, and thinly populated area? Well, he got the attention of a provincial governor. This provincial governor, after the painter's father died, Zamyatin recognized Surikov's talent and introduced him to the man who would become his patron. That was the owner of a gold mine, Pyotr Kuznetsov. And with the help and financial backing of these two men, Surikov at the age of 20 was able to go to St. Petersburg to study art there. And that is how this painting became the start of a long and illustrious art career. View of the monument to Peter the Great in St. Petersburg. This is an 1870 painting by Vasily Surikov. I mentioned before that Surikov grew up in a cold and remote place in Siberia, and his first major painting was a portrait of one of the two men in high places who he made friends with, after his father died, of course, in order to jumpstart his career and finance his art school education in St. Petersburg. This view of the statue of Peter the Great, one of the famous Russian emperors, in front of St. Isaac's Cathedral in the city, was one of his first major paintings after he got to St. Petersburg, and would have likely been a scene he saw quite frequently while he was there. A lot of people say that the statue, contrasted with the daily goings-on of the people in the background of the painting, was meant to emphasize history intertwining with daily life. Peter the Great, of course, being mainly known for modernizing Russia and adopting a lot of practices from Western Europe during his time. The choice to make this painting a nighttime scene is also interesting. Another piece of realist painting that makes me wonder how often the artist himself walked around the city at night. Evening in Petersburg. This is an 1871 painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov was a realist painter. He painted things as he saw them, with emotional honesty being priority. Nothing is romanticized or idealized. And even so, from this painting, Petersburg looks like a very pleasant city to be in. Streetlights, nice atmosphere, horse-drawn carts, friendly-looking people standing talking. The mid to late 19th century is sometimes called the golden age of Russian culture. We see writers like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky active during this time. We see painters like Ilya Repin and Yaroshenko, who we've already covered, and now Surikov as well. And despite the intense social and political upheaval that was brewing, and despite the immense class inequality, the sheer volume of art and literary works from Russia during this time makes it a period that is easy to romanticize. Or at least that's how I feel. Under the Rain, By the Coach to Black River. This is an 1871 painting by Vasily Surikov. Detaching from the more well-known oil-on-canvas painting style, this one is done by watercolor, which fits the theme of a rainy day. Surikov did this when he was studying at the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg, and he was actually at that school at the same time as Ilya Repin. For 2 years they were classmates. And this painting is known as a genre painting. That category is for paintings that capture mundane scenes from everyday life. And people traveling by coach in St. Petersburg on a rainy day does fit that description. And it was also part of the realist art movement. Repin was also a pretty big realist painter. Russian realism in painting is about emotional honesty, portraying things as they really were, avoiding any romanticized or glorified depictions of, well, anything really. And that candor is part of what makes the beauty of these paintings. Holy Face. This is an 1872 painting by Vasily Surikov. This depicts, of course, the moment when Christ is on his way to execution, and somebody uses a cloth to wipe the sweat and dirt off his face, and an imprint or image of his face is left on the cloth. Many who care about religious artifacts claim that this cloth is still around today, still with the face of Jesus on it, known as the Shroud of Turin. As for the painter, he was finishing up his time at art school in St. Petersburg when he painted this. He had a real challenging upbringing, but now he's in the big city, he has an education under his belt, he's on his way up. And I find it interesting that he, under these circumstances, chose to make a religious painting one of his early works. I have to wonder, scale of 1 to 10, how invested was he really in religion, or was he more painting for an audience? As far as the style goes, Surikov was very much a realist, meaning he prized emotional honesty in his paintings, no romanticizing things. And that trait makes it really interesting to look closely at the faces of each of the people in these paintings. Peter I dragged ships from the Onega Bay in 1702. This is an 1872 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is one of his historical paintings for which he is well known. This is an earlier painting of his. In fact, I believe the artist was working on this when he was still in art school. And the story of the historical event that this painting depicts, it was a time when Russia was at war with Sweden. And for strategic purposes, the Russians needed to get ships onto Lake Ladoga. So they did something a little bold. They built a 180-kilometer long, they call it a portage road for these ships, and they dragged, I believe, 2 warships over land for over 100 miles. It took 5,000 people a month and a half to build this road, and it took them 10 days to drag the ships over the distance on land. And this resulted in a great military success because they were able to surprise the Swedish so well. And hats off to Surikov for painting this. Salome brings the head of John the Baptist to her mother. This is an 1872 painting by Vasily Surikov. And of course, this depicts the story from the Gospel where John the Baptist is killed. Herod, of course, is enamored with Salome, who I believe is a teenager at this point. She dances for him, and he allows her to ask for a favor. Her mother coerces her into asking for the head of John the Baptist. And of course, he gives it. And this is Salome presenting the head to her mother. The mother looks a little bit maniacal. And looking at Salome's expression, I think the artist had an interesting take on this. She looks a little annoyed and tense, like she would rather have asked for a new iPhone or something. But no, her stupid mother made her ask for this stupid head. I think that's kind of a funny dynamic that's being portrayed here. As far as Surikov goes, this is really early in his art career. In fact, he is still in his early 20s. He is still in art school at this point. He certainly has the detail down, but I think he could still use a little development in the emotions that he... Temptation of Christ. This is an 1872 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is not the only painting this year where Surikov used a medium other than oil on canvas. This was done with charcoal on whitewash paper. Which, if you think about what it would take to get the details looking that precise with charcoal, that is actually pretty impressive. This is a biblical painting showing Matthew chapter 4 when Christ is doing his fast in the desert and Satan gives him the 3 temptations. This is something that other Russian painters have done as well. Surikov is known as a member of the realist movement of painting, which means emotional honesty, no romanticizing things, and to my Western eye, this doesn't really fit that genre exactly. The devil looks played up, looks how you expect him to look, especially the emotional aspect. Jesus looks how a lot of other painters portrayed him, especially the emotional aspect. But I suppose we have to remember this is Russian realism. Surikov was in a time and place surrounded by Orthodox Church icon paintings, and he painted this Christ looking fully human. A Rich Man and Lazarus. This is an 1873 painting by Vasily Surikov. This was also one of the paintings he did when he was still in art school. This illustrates a parable of Jesus from Luke 16, where a rich man who lives in extravagant wealth ignores a poor beggar who was begging for scraps from his table. We see the man, of course, laying on a bed with fancy blankets, fancy textiles. Being tended to by servants, we see exotic birds there, that's another sign of wealth. And by contrast, in the bottom right corner, we see that poor man on the street, living among the dogs. I thought that was significant. I know that even today there is a stray dog problem in Russia and Turkey as well. I can only assume that would have extended a little further south into the Levant as well. But I know for a Russian looking at that, living among the dogs on the street would have been a sure sign of poverty. This painting is oil on canvas, and the artist made use of different lights and shadings for this painting. Not all of his paintings during his time in art school were oil on canvas. He liked to use different mediums sometimes. Izba. This is an 1873 painting by Vasily Surikov. This painting is watercolor rather than oil on canvas. Many paintings are oil on canvas. Surikov, at this time, he was attending art school in St. Petersburg, and he was also experimenting with different mediums. He did at least one charcoal painting as well. The title of the painting, Izba, is a word for a type of wooden peasant hut, such as the one in the painting. And one can imagine Surikov himself probably grew up in such a place. He was born in Siberia, north of Mongolia. This was after the Russian Tsars conquered the wilderness, but before Stalin populated the wilderness. So this was a pretty remote place with a pretty cold climate. Not much going on there besides fur trapping and gold mining. And to top it off, the artist's father died when he was young. And the only reason he got into art school was because he got the attention of an influential provincial governor by making a portrait of that man. So, while in art school, he's painting the type of realistic scene that he probably knows well. Minuzinsk on the Way. This is an 1873 painting by Vasily Surikov. And this was done in watercolor rather than the more traditional oil on canvas. Surikov actually did a lot of watercolors at this time in his career. This one he did either during or shortly after he finished art school. He was staying in St. Petersburg at the time, That is one of the most significant cities in Russia, and it's pretty far west as far as Russian geography goes. The artist would have had to travel a long way to get there from his native town in Siberia. That was pretty far east and a pretty remote location as far as population centers in Russia go. So traveling between those two locations, which he would have done at least a handful of times, he might have spent months at a time in traveling groups such as this one. And it's around these few years in his early painting career that he did a lot of paintings which show snapshots of everyday life in Siberia and life for Russian peasantry in general. It's one thing to read about history, it's another thing to see it from the brush of someone who lived it. Siberian Landscape, Torgashino. This is an 1873 painting by Vasily Surikov, done with watercolor and pencil. I think the watercolor was an especially good decision for this one because I see a lot brighter colors than we would have gotten with oil on canvas. The grass and the sky in particular, I feel like it's a really sunny day out there. Surikov was actually born in Siberia, and the location of this painting is pretty near his hometown. This painter is a pretty great success story. Came from humble beginnings, his father died when he was young, and through his painting he got the attention of the right people and was able to pay his way through art school with their help. And it was on his way to and from art school in St. Petersburg. Those were multiple month-long journeys where he painted a lot of landscapes and a lot of scenes of Siberian life. And it's interesting to look at this painting and picture what life is like on those places on the northern parts of the Central Asian steppe. Belshazzar's Feast. This is an 1874 painting by Vasily Surikov. One of multiple biblical paintings that he did early on in his art career. In fact, he was still in art school at the time this was painted. Although he did a lot of painting with watercolor during this time, and even some with charcoal on paper, this painting was oil on canvas. And you can see that in the variety of colors and shades that are displayed here. This depicts the feast of King Belshazzar from the Book of Daniel. After he captured Jerusalem, he has a feast in celebration where he sees the ghostly hand write a message on the wall, summons all sorts of prophets and diviners to try and figure out what the message says, what it means, and Daniel is the one who's able to interpret that. You can see in the feast there's a little bit of chaos, people don't know what's going on, wine jugs are being tipped over. Surikov is known as a realist painter, meaning he strove for emotional honesty. And you can see this is not some glorified, idealized, romanticized display, but he did his best to display the emotions as they really were. On the Nevsky Prospect at night, this is an 1874 painting by Vasily Surikov. It shows a nighttime scene in St. Petersburg, except the painting itself is bright enough it doesn't feel like nighttime. That is because this is a watercolor painting. A lot of famous painters, especially in the 19th century, like to do oil on canvas. That was the more traditional medium, but Surikov spent a lot of time using watercolors, and the reason is a little bit unique. Surikov grew up in Siberia, and he went to study art in St. Petersburg. It is a 1-month travel time between those two places, and Surikov spent a lot of time on the road, and watercolor just so happens to be a lot more convenient, a lot less cumbersome to paint with while traveling. So if you imagine like a Wild West Oregon Trail wagon train, except in Siberia speaking Russian, and then there's some dude who's destined to become a famous artist just with a whole art setup while traveling. That is Surikov, and this is one. On the Nevsky Prospect at night, this is an 1874 painting by Vasily Surikov. It shows a nighttime scene in St. Petersburg, except the painting itself is bright enough it doesn't feel like nighttime. That is because this is a watercolor painting. A lot of famous painters, especially in the 19th century, like to do oil on canvas. That was the more traditional medium, but Surikov spent a lot of time using watercolors, and the reason is a little bit unique. Surikov grew up in Siberia, and he went to study art in St. Petersburg. It is a 1-month travel time between those two places, and Surikov spent a lot of time on the road, and watercolor just so happens to be a lot more convenient, a lot less cumbersome to paint with while traveling. So if you imagine like a Wild West Oregon Trail wagon train, except in Siberia speaking Russian, and then there's some dude who's destined to become a famous artist just with a whole art setup while traveling, that is Surikov, and this is one. On Nevsky Prospect during the day, this is an 1874 painting by Vasily Surikov. It is also a partner painting to his other painting on Nevsky Prospect at night. These are both watercolor paintings. Surikov in the 1870s played around a lot with watercolor as opposed to oil on canvas, which a lot of other painters use. Watercolor, well, you can tell the difference just by looking at it. It has brighter colors, it feels more vibrant. As opposed to oil on canvas, there's a lot more potential for texture that can be done with oil on canvas. As for the context of this painting, it is a location in St. Petersburg in Russia. That is where the painter studied art. It is also where the painter lived during the time that his wife died. Definitely a troubled character. His father died young, and he's still in his 20s, and his wife is already dead. So during this lonely time, He would spend time in the Nevsky Prospect, presumably people watching he would attend the cathedral there, and these two paintings sprung out of The Good Samaritan. This is an 1874 painting by Vasily Surikov. This painting was done during the artist's time studying in St. Petersburg at art school. He studied there at the same time as Ilya Repin, another famous painter, and both of them did their fair share of religious paintings. Both of them are also associated with the realist art movement, and one of the characteristics of that is emotional honesty. They do not romanticize or idealize anything in their paintings. They strive to paint things, and especially emotions and people, as they really were. So when approaching religious works, this is not a stained glass window type of painting. And that's especially relevant when we're looking at Russian painters, because their historical context is the Russian Orthodox Church, known for their glorified, glamorized religious icons. And then to contrast that, we have these realist painters painting human beings with human emotions. This painting was oil on canvas as well. That contrasts with a lot of the artist's other paintings, which were watercolor, especially his landscapes at this time. And those two mediums definitely have different looks to them. Assassination of Julius Caesar. This is an 1875 painting by Vasily Surikov. The artist was in his 20s when he did this. He was still in art school in St. Petersburg. This one was created with a combination of watercolor and charcoal on paper. And you can see the mix of the two with the outlines of the shapes, as well as how the color and the depth feels of the painting. It has a different look, a different style to it than an oil on canvas painting would. Oil on canvas being much more popular among the famous painters of the world. Surikov, though, spent a lot more time doing watercolor paintings, which is one of the things that makes him a little bit unique as an artist. The other thing he's known for is his paintings of historical scenes, of which this is one of his first major ones. You can see Caesar in this painting still alive, still sitting on his chair, maybe looking a little bit confused, all the people gathered around him, and the poor guy doesn't know what's coming next. It's a good display of the realist art style that this painter used, and that stressed emotional honesty, painting things as they really were, rather than romanticizing the moment, emphasizing candid human emotion. Assassination of Julius Caesar. This is an 1875 painting by Vasily Surikov. The artist was in his 20s when he did this. He was still in art school in St. Petersburg. This one was created with a combination of watercolor and charcoal on paper. And you can see the mix of the two with the outlines of the shapes, as well as how the color and the depth feels of the painting. It has a different look, a different style to it than an oil on canvas painting would. Oil on canvas being much more popular among the famous painters of the world. Surikov, though, spent a lot more time doing watercolor paintings, which is one of the things that makes him a little bit unique as an artist. The other thing he's known for is his paintings of historical scenes, of which this is one of his first major ones. You can see Caesar in this painting still alive, still sitting on his chair, maybe looking a little bit confused, all the people gathered around him, and the poor guy doesn't know what's coming next. It's a good display of the realist art style that this painter used, and that stressed emotional honesty, painting things as they really were, rather than romanticizing the moment, emphasizing candid human emotion. The Apostle Paul explains the tenets of his faith to the King Agrippa. That is Herod Agrippa, and this is an 1875 painting by Vasily Surikov. This painting is oil on canvas, and you can see it by the detailed texture. That and the deep, rich colors are one way to tell this apart from a watercolor or a charcoal on watercolor painting. That other medium is also a medium that Surikov, the painter, explored quite a bit. Most painters stuck mostly to oil on canvas. Surikov was pretty adaptable in that way. As for the subject of the painting, Surikov was also no stranger to painting religious scenes. He also painted the Temptation of Christ and the Good Samaritan before this. This particular scene is based on Acts chapter 26, where Paul defends his faith legally in front of King Herod. Paul's Roman citizenship does come into play in this situation. Surikov was part of the realist art movement. That meant he strove for emotional honesty. Rather than romanticizing or idealizing anything, he painted people and especially emotions as they really were. You can see that in the people's faces in this painting. Belfry Ivan the Great. This is an 1876 painting by Vasily Surikov. This one was done in watercolor, which was one of Surikov's specialties. He spent a lot more time working in watercolor than most painters, the more traditional medium being oil on canvas. But Surikov developed some skill in it. As you can see here, he was able to capture the architectural details pretty well. This was the year that he finished up art school. He studied in St. Petersburg, and following that he moved to Moscow. That is where this building is located. This is the Assumption Cathedral in the Moscow Kremlin. Of course, when Americans hear the word Kremlin, we think of the Kremlin, that is the Kremlin in Moscow. And a lot of people imagine it to be a single government building. But that's not exactly the case. Of course, in medieval times, cities had walls around them for protection. And Kremlin in Russia means the inside wall of a city. That's the protected area inside the most interior wall. It usually had government and religious buildings inside it. And in the case of Moscow, one of those buildings is the cathedral scene. Belfry Ivan the Great. This is an 1876 painting by Vasily Surikov. This one was done in watercolor, which was one of Surikov's specialties. He spent a lot more time working in watercolor than most painters, the more traditional medium being oil on canvas. But Surikov developed some skill in it. As you can see here, he was able to capture the architectural details pretty well. This was the year that he finished up art school. He studied in St. Petersburg, and following that he moved to Moscow. That is where this building is located. This is the Assumption Cathedral in the Moscow Kremlin. Of course, when Americans hear the word Kremlin, we think of the Kremlin, that is the Kremlin in Moscow. And a lot of people imagine it to be a single government building. But that's not exactly the case. Of course, in medieval times, cities had walls around them for protection. And Kremlin in Russia means the inside wall of a city. That's the protected area inside the most interior wall. It usually had government and religious buildings inside it. And in the case of Moscow, one of those buildings is the cathedral scene. First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea. This is an 1876 painting by Vasily Surikov. This painting was done with oil on canvas as opposed to watercolor, which Surikov also used quite a bit to paint. And this painting was also done shortly after the artist graduated from art school in St. Petersburg, Russia. Surikov was part of the realist art movement, meaning he prized emotional honesty above all else. If you can imagine Russian Orthodox Church icons, glorifying, sanctifying, romanticizing lots and lots of people, the realist painters took a turn away from that and tried to paint human emotion as it really was. And you can see that in this painting, the faces of the people debating, deliberating, disagreeing. The event in question, the First Council of Nicaea, was in 325 AD. Now, despite being so much closer to the time of Christ than we are today, they are still pretty far from the time of Christ. Think of the American Revolution, we are closer to that event than they were from the time of Christ. This council concluded that Christ was both fully human and fully divine, but I bet they wished they could have asked him firsthand. Fourth Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon. This is an 1876 painting by Vasily Surikov. The medium of this painting was the more popular, more traditional oil on canvas as opposed to watercolor, which Surikov spent a lot of time working with in contrast to other famous painters. One of the reasons probably was that this painting was commissioned to be put inside the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow. Talented as Surikov was with watercolor, I don't think a customer as prestigious as a cathedral would have wanted something like that inside their building. Something else that would have been a little bit of a turn away from tradition was the artist being part of the realist art movement in Russia. And the main idea of that was emotional honesty in the artwork, portraying people and emotions as they really were. That contrasted a little bit with the glorified, romanticized, idealized church icons that a lot of traditional churches had. That is not what realist art was about, and you can see it looking at the faces of the people in this painting. While debating the divinity of Christ, they are absolutely Samovar. This is an 1876 painting by Vasily Surikov. This painter had only recently finished art school when he did this one. And furthermore, he's much better known for his realist-style paintings of historical scenes and biblical scenes. He even did some landscapes that he's somewhat known for, but relatively few still-life paintings, of which this is one of them. The aspect of this painting that does fit his style, though, is he did it in watercolor as opposed to the more traditional oil on canvas that other painters were more likely to prefer. The medium of watercolor became sort of a niche skill that Surikov developed early in his career. And looking at this painting, what I think he was doing might have been practicing working with shadows and shading and maybe even a little bit illustrating depth with this medium that few other artists bothered putting a lot of time into. One of the reasons he probably did watercolor is because it was easier to travel with. He studied in St. Petersburg, and of course his hometown was in Siberia. So traveling to and from there, it would have been a long journey, probably by wagon train. Second Ecumenical Council of Constantinople. This is an 1876 painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov made oil paintings of multiple councils from early church history in this year, 1876. And in fact, this one in particular was his graduation piece from art school. He studied at the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg, Russia. The council in question that is depicted here was held in 381 AD. This was the one where they affirmed the full divinity of the Holy Spirit, and they finalized the Nicene Creed, which is still spoken on a daily basis by Christians today. Surikov was part of the realist art movement, and that movement was about emotional honesty, portraying things as they really were, without romanticizing or idealizing anything. And this was a little bit of a contrast to the type of icon paintings that the Russian Orthodox Church of the time, and still today by the way, liked to display and say prayers to. Icons that are considered holy in their own right, as opposed to very human realist paintings that are honest about messy human emotions. Third Ecumenical Council of Ephesus. This is an 1876 painting by Vasily Surikov, and it's not the only painting of an early church council that he did in 1876. In fact, there are several others just from this year. At least two of them, including this one, he did for the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow, Russia. This particular church council was held in the year 431 AD. It is the council where they condemned the teachings of Nestorius. Now, if you're familiar with Christianity in Russia, you'll know that they have a strong Orthodox tradition going back centuries. And if you're familiar with Orthodox Christianity, you'll probably be familiar with religious icons. Those are paintings meant to be prayed to as holy items in themselves. They are notably ornate, they glorify the individuals they present. And if you're familiar with those, you'll notice this is not one of those. Surikov was part of the realist art movement. That meant he went for emotional honesty in his paintings, did not romanticize or idealize anything, just portrayed emotions as they really were. Third Ecumenical Council of Ephesus. This is an 1876 painting by Vasily Surikov, and it's not the only painting of an early church council that he did in 1876. In fact, there are several others just from this year. At least two of them, including this one, he did for the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow, Russia. This particular church council was held in the year 431 AD. It is the council where they condemned the teachings of Nestorius. Now, if you're familiar with Christianity in Russia, you'll know that they have a strong Orthodox tradition going back centuries. And if you're familiar with Orthodox Christianity, you'll probably be familiar with religious icons. Those are paintings meant to be prayed to as holy items in themselves. They are notably ornate, they glorify the individuals they present. And if you're familiar with those, you'll notice this is not one of those. Surikov was part of the realist art movement. That meant he went for emotional honesty in his paintings, did not romanticize or idealize anything, just portrayed emotions as they really were. View of the Kremlin in winter. This is an 1876 watercolor painting by Vasily Surikov. The medium of watercolor being significant because Surikov did quite a few landscapes and cityscapes in watercolor as opposed to oil on canvas. He did do oil on canvas as well. He did a lot of historical and religious paintings in that medium, but not a lot of other painters did watercolor. At least not the famous ones, but Surikov did. In fact, he practiced a significant amount of time with it and got some skill in it. One reason probably was that watercolor painting equipment was less cumbersome to bring around while traveling, which the artist did spend a lot of time traveling long distance. But even if he's just going out on the town in a place like Moscow, where he did live at the time of painting this, I can imagine him going out, setting up his workstation outdoors, and being physically present at the location that he was painting firsthand while he was painting it. This was early in his painting career as well. In fact, this was the year he graduated from art school, and he's already getting some pretty good skill working with this medium. Black-Bearded Old Man. This is an 1879 painting by Vasily Surikov. This painting was done in oil paint, and it's a study work for one of his larger paintings that he later completed in 1881. That larger painting depicted the Streltsy executions. This is still relatively early in Surikov's painting career, but as he keeps painting and keeps developing, he would become very well known for his large-scale historical paintings. And this portrait, which is sort of like a training picture for one of the characters depicted in that painting, is an example of the work and the care that he put into that. Surikov was also a part of the Russian realist art movement. That meant that he strove for emotional honesty in his paintings above all else, did not want to romanticize or idealize anything, portrayed people and emotions as they really were. And on that note, let's look at this man's facial expression. This is meant to be one of the people on the execution block who's about to lose his life because he participated in a rebellion. So to appreciate this painting as the artist intended, let's look at his face and his eyes and try to guess what this man is thinking. Self-portrait. This is an 1879 painting by Vasily Surikov. He chose to do this one on oil and canvas rather than watercolor. One of this painter's sort of niches was that he spent time developing a talent for watercolor painting, but he seems to have reserved most of his watercolor work for landscapes and cityscapes. For faces like this one, he more often did oil on canvas. That was a more common and more traditional painting style. The man you see here was born in Siberia, grew up there, his father died at a young age, worked hard, got the attention of the right people, and convinced a patron to pay his way through art school in St. Petersburg. Finished up art school in 1876, and now, 3 years later, the time of this painting, he is newly married and living in Moscow, He is making a name for himself as a painter, and some of his most well-known works are still ahead of him. So this self-portrait captures the artist at a vigorous and flourishing time in his life. For those of you who want to know where this painting is, it is in an art gallery in Moscow. Do with that information what you will. Portrait of E.K. Derezhina. This is an 1879 oil-on-canvas painting by Vasily Surikov. And the fun mystery is we don't know who she is or anything about her life, which makes this a fun exercise because portrait painting is about telling the viewer more than just what the person looked like, but telling the viewer something about their personality through the portrait. So what can we learn about her from this? Well, based off the hat, the flower on her blouse, and the fact it looks like she's standing in a garden, I would guess that it's meant to be springtime in this portrait. So probably springtime was her favorite time of year, probably because she likes flowers. She probably enjoys taking walks outside in a garden. Based on her face and her outfit, she strikes me as a lady of the house. So she probably does have a home with a flower garden and maybe even servants who tend it. She's wearing a dark blue, almost black. I don't think it's a morning outfit, I think it's just a very dark blue. And looking at her eyes, I don't know if he painted that much shadow on purpose, but she looks sad and maybe reflective about something, so maybe she's going to the peace and quiet of a garden because she needs time to think. Strelets with Cap. This is an 1879 painting by Vasily Surikov. This one is a study painting, meaning it's something he painted in practice or in preparation for a larger and more significant work. The more significant work in question would come 2 years after this was painted, in an 1881 painting called Morning of the Streltsy Execution. And the historical event depicted there was the execution of a group of people known as the Streltsy, who launched a failed rebellion against Peter the Great in 1698. The man in this painting is one of those Streltsy, and that larger painting will show him on the day of his execution. Surikov at this point had not yet done very many huge historical paintings, but he would do them in the future and he would become very well known for them. Those historical paintings he typically did with oil on canvas, as opposed to the medium of watercolor, which he did practice a fair amount with. Not all famous painters did pay attention to watercolor. In fact, most of them were almost exclusively oil on canvas. Samara. This is an 1880 watercolor painting by Vasily Surikov. Samara is a town in the southern part of the eastern section of Russia, that is the European section of Russia. Historically, it has been a fortress town, an important location for guarding the Russian frontier in Siberia. And in modern times, I understand that they have a lot of their space program here along with academics. But in 1880, this town was the home of the famous painter Vasily Surikov. Surikov was a few years out of art school at this point, and one of his niches in his artwork was that he made more use of watercolor than most painters. Especially when he did landscapes and cityscapes, he quite often used watercolor in those. He often painted places where he traveled through and also places where he lived. And since watercolor was a less cumbersome medium for painting than the more popular, more traditional oil on canvas, one can imagine him taking his travel art kit, which happened to be watercolor, outside somewhere and just setting up and painting what he saw. Morning of the Streltsy Execution. This is an 1881 oil on canvas painting by Vasily Surikov. This is one of his first massive historical paintings. It's certainly one that he spent a lot of time on. He spent years working on this. And we also have a lot of the sketches and the studies he did in preparation for this that we can look at. The artist would become pretty famous for his massive historical paintings like this one, but this is one of his first. And when I say massive, I do mean in terms of physical size. This one is 7 feet 6 inches tall and 12 foot 8 inches wide. So taller than a human being in both directions. The rebellion and execution happened in 1698. That was when Peter the Great was doing his famous tour of Europe, which he actually had to cut short in order to deal with this rebellion. And the execution in the painting happened to over 1,000 people right in the square of Moscow. And if you know anything about Peter the Great, this will be a transformative moment for Russian culture as well. Icon Lamp. This is an 1881 painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov in his painting was part of the Russian realist art movement. And Russia, as you know, the dominant religion is Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And Orthodox Christians are very fond of icons. These are religious paintings that are meant to be prayed to and worshipped as if they are the person they are depicting. This could be Jesus, Mary, any of the saints. And this painting from 1881 shows us a lamp that's meant to illuminate one of these paintings. The lighting has changed a bit in the past 150 years, but the paintings are very much still around if you visit an Orthodox church today. Just goes to show us that the more things change, the more they stay the same. This painting was done in oil on canvas. Surikov also had a niche for watercolor painting. He more often used watercolor for landscapes and cityscapes. He used it when he was out traveling. Oil on canvas is the more traditional, more widely used art medium, and Surikov used it for his huge historical paintings, as well as most of the things he would have done while sitting inside. Portrait of N.S. Matveev. This is a watercolor portrait done by Vasily Surikov in 1881. In the same year, Surikov also did another portrait of another member of the Matveev family, either a son or a nephew of the man we see here. That other portrait was done in oil on canvas, but this one, you can probably see the difference, was done in watercolor and pencil. Matveev himself was also an artist. He was a peer of Surikov, so it's fun that they got to paint each other like this. And I can imagine the professional painting discussions that they had during this meeting, specifically because of Surikov's choice of medium. Watercolor was something that Surikov spent more time with than a lot of other artists. Oil on canvas was a much more common and more traditional medium for painting. But Surikov developed a skill for it by spending time doing a lot of landscapes and cityscapes. And now we see that work paying off here, where he's able to get a pretty good amount of detail in a human face. Princess Zhenya Gordunova with portrait of her dead groom prince. This is an 1881 painting by Vasily Surikov. For those of you who watched the Russian prisons video and think that name sounds familiar, this is the daughter of Tsar Boris Godunov from the time of troubles in Russia, one of the many short-reigning emperors who held the throne for a short time after Ivan the Terrible's death. Well, during her time, Gordunova got married to the Prince of Denmark. Or at least she tried to. The prince came to Moscow for the wedding and died shortly after the marriage, so she was married only a short time. This painting's actual size is almost 5 feet by almost 4 feet. Surikov the painter, one of the things he's known for is his large historical paintings. This is far from his largest. He has done much larger both before and after this. And 1881 was a very prolific time for the artist as well. He finished another huge piece, morning of the Streltsy execution during that same year, as well as several other pieces, both watercolor and oil on canvas. Illumination of Moscow. This is an 1882 painting by Vasily Surikov. The painter lived in Moscow during this time, and the year is significant because the Hermitage Gardens in Moscow got their first electric lights just 2 years earlier in 1880. So this painting shows sort of a contrasting view of a very familiar cityscape, familiar skyline that millions of people would have been familiar with at the time, and a very new kind of technology, electric lights. The contrast is also interesting because in 1878, that's when the author Tolstoy published Anna Karenina, one of his bigger books. And in that book, Moscow and St. Petersburg, two of Russia's largest cities, are presented as sort of foils to one another, Moscow representing old imperial tradition, and St. Petersburg representing new, exciting, European-influenced technological advancement. And then, just 2 years later, Moscow Gardens get electric lights. So this painting ends up serving as a really nice snapshot in time. Portrait of Princess S.A. Kropotkina with a guitar. This is an 1882 painting by Vasily Surikov. The Princess Sophia is actually Surikov's sister-in-law by marriage. She was married to Peter Kropotkin, who was the brother of Surikov's wife. And the title Princess comes from Peter's lineage. He was descended long ago from the Russian house of Rurik. Peter himself did not like using that title that he has by virtue of birth, but Sophia took it, liked it, and ran with it. To the point where apparently a lot of her friends and acquaintances called her Princess Sophia on a regular basis. Now this painting is watercolor on paper as opposed to the more popular, more traditional oil on canvas. Watercolor, though, was something that the artist Surikov took a lot of time to hone his skill with. He did mostly landscapes and cityscapes in watercolor, but he also did a few portraits in it as well, including this one. So if you want a small, tiny sliver of a portrait of life at a Surikov family gathering, here you have it. The Elder Menchikov's Daughter. This is an 1882 painting by Vasily Surikov. This one could be considered a study sketch for his larger 1883 painting, Menchikov in Berezovo. But despite that painting being done in oil on canvas, this painting was done in watercolor. Watercolor being something that Surikov practiced quite a bit and developed a niche talent for. He did a lot of cityscapes and landscapes in watercolor, but he also did some portraits, as you can see here. As for the subject of this painting, this girl was once betrothed to Emperor Peter II. That is not Peter the Great, that is the grandson of Peter the Great. And Peter II only had a 3-year reign, pretty short. But her father, Menchikov, disgraced himself badly enough that he got exiled to Siberia, along with his family, of course. Because of that, the betrothal was called off, and this girl did not have a happy ending. She ended up dying of smallpox at the age of 17. The model in ancient Russian costume. This is an 1882 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is another study painting in preparation for his larger work, Menshikov and Borizovo, which he would paint a year after this. So the figure we see here is included somewhere in that larger work. As for who she is, well, she's not named, obviously. As for who the art model was, well, that's not known either. Surikov, well, a lot of artists, not just Surikov, often used real people and real faces as models for various people in their paintings. His wife ended up sitting for multiple of his paintings. There's also one story of a different person he painted. He found an old lady in a church graveyard and asked her to model one of the figures in his paintings for him. This one, though, we do not know for sure. The Old Gardener. This is an 1882 painting by Vasily Surikov. For the subject of this painting, this is where Surikov starts to feel more similar to Ilya Repin or Yeroshenko, painting something that gave attention to and uplifted Russian peasantry, and 1882, that was a good year to do it, politically speaking. The attitudes of the Russian people have a revolutionary undercurrent in this decade, one which would eventually lead to the overthrow of the entire government about 35 years later. And the other two realist painters I mentioned, Ilya Repin and Yeroshenko, both happen to be really big advocates of fixing the social inequality that existed between the nobility and the peasantry. This painting from someone who was an art school classmate of Ilya Repin perhaps reinforces that sentiment. Repin in particular was actually good friends with the artist of this work, and they shared a lot of acquaintances in intellectual and artistic circles in Moscow. The Old Gardener. This is an 1882 painting by Vasily Surikov. For the subject of this painting, this is where Surikov starts to feel more similar to Ilya Repin or Yeroshenko, painting something that gave attention to and uplifted Russian peasantry, and 1882, that was a good year to do it, politically speaking. The attitudes of the Russian people have a revolutionary undercurrent in this decade, one which would eventually lead to the overthrow of the entire government about 35 years later. And the other two realist painters I mentioned, Ilya Repin and Yeroshenko, both happen to be really big advocates of fixing the social inequality that existed between the nobility and the peasantry. This painting from someone who was an art school classmate of Ilya Repin perhaps reinforces that sentiment. Repin in particular was actually good friends with the artist of this work, and they shared a lot of acquaintances in intellectual and artistic circles in Moscow. Menshikov and Borizovo. This is an 1883 painting by Vasily Surikov. The Menshikov in question was a member of the Russian government under Peter the Great. After Peter the Great's death under Catherine I, he gained influence until he became de facto leader of Russia. But after Peter II succeeded Catherine, he fell out of favor. He was accused of treason and embezzlement, and he went into political exile in a place called Borizovo in Siberia. And in this painting, Vasily Surikov, who actually grew up in Siberia, paints what he imagined this man would have looked like sitting in a cabin with his family towards the end of his life. Of the four people in this painting, both the father and one of the daughters died of smallpox within a year of going to Siberia. The other daughter died in childbirth 7 years after that. The son of Menshikov actually was the only one of the family who lived an extended time after they all came to Siberia. Interesting piece of Russian history through painting. Portrait of Olga Surikova in childhood. This is an 1884 painting by Vasily Surikov. And of course, the last name Surikova, this is the artist's daughter. And the thing with the art of portrait making is telling the audience not only what a person looked like, but something about their personality as well. So we can look at the person in this painting, the face, the clothing, the way they hold themselves, other items in the room, and try to deduce something about what they were like based off of that information. The other thing to notice about this particular painting is the medium. This was done in 1884. It is watercolor. Surikov also did another painting of his daughter in 1888. That one was oil on canvas. Watercolor painting was one of Surikov's niches that not a lot of other artists did. He really spent a lot of time with it, starting out with landscapes and cityscapes, and then later moving on to something with as much detail as a human face, which is kind of impressive in itself because that medium isn't something that lends itself well to detail. Surikov had been painting more than a decade at this time, and you can judge for yourself how good he got at details in watercolor. The Colosseum. This is an 1884 watercolor painting by Vasily Surikov. I've seen people say that this painting was a bit out of character for Surikov, in that he typically painted things which were fixtures of Russian identity, and here he is painting something in Rome. Well, knowing what I know of him so far, I don't think it's strange at all. He happened to have been on a trip to Rome. He was already in the habit of taking his watercolor painting equipment out and about with him. He saw a part of the landscape cityscape that was beautiful in its antiquity, and he painted it much the same as he already painted scenes from Moscow and Siberia. He happened to be there, he happened to have his painting with him. 1 + 1 is 2. and 2, in this case, is a visually appealing picture of an ancient Roman landmark. And I think the watercolor was a good choice for this too, because it makes the colors and the sun and the lighting come out in a way that you wouldn't have gotten with oil on canvas. Famous painters being truly talented with watercolor is something you see a little less often, but Surikov worked hard and he achieved it. Florence. This is an 1884 painting by Vasily Surikov done during his trip to Europe. This is a cityscape of a very famous city, and this one was done in watercolor as opposed to oil on canvas. Oil paints being the more traditional, more widely used medium for artwork. But Surikov during his career developed a talent for watercolor, and that became sort of his niche. He first started working in that medium early on during his days in art school. He grew up in Siberia, went to school all the way in St. Petersburg. It was a month journey in between the two places. He would take his watercolor painting equipment on the road with him and paint things that he saw. And this habit he kept up with in both urban and rural life. Painted lots of beautiful cities, painted lots of rural scenes, and now, nearly a decade out of art school, he is traveling through Italy and painting a lot of the famous places there. And doing it with a level of talent and attention to detail that not many other painters can manage to get with watercolor. Florence Walk. This is an 1884 painting by Vasily Surikov. You may notice this painting is very, very similar to another painting called just Florence of the same year. He painted both of these during a tour of Europe that he took with his family. Both of them were done in watercolor, which this artist had a rare talent for. He spent a lot of time doing both cityscapes and landscape paintings, and practiced enough to get a level of detail that not many other painters could achieve with watercolor medium. He also had a pretty impressive talent for oil on canvas painting. In fact, some of his best known works are the huge historical paintings that are oil on canvas. But I think his talent for watercolor cityscapes is really underrated. And the one other thing that stands out about this painting as opposed to the other painting, which is just Florence, both of these paintings show a near identical point of view of the same place, but this painting has a few figures of human beings walking in the distance. It is widely accepted that those are the artist's wife and children who went on the trip with him. Italian Woman. This is an 1884 painting by Vasily Surikov. This was done actually during a trip to Italy that he took. This one was done in oil on canvas, although this particular artist was also fond of doing watercolor, both cityscapes, landscapes, and occasionally portraits as well. Doing that kind of painting in watercolor was a unique challenge for artists, but Surikov also had a unique talent for it that he worked hard to attain. I like to contrast this painting with another painting of the same name, Italian Woman, by a different artist, Ilya Repin. I find this Italian woman to be a lot more homely, a lot more plain, a lot more simply dressed. You can imagine this woman being in the kitchen of a rural home, whereas Repin's painting is a younger-looking woman. You can imagine her in a lot more urban setting in the street somewhere at some social gathering. Repin's Italian Woman does not look happy at all. She looks like maybe a boyfriend made her angry or something. Whereas this particular Italian woman looks a little more contented, maybe God-fearing, I would say. Italian Women. This is an 1884 watercolor painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov painted this during an 1884 tour of Europe where he spent a lot of time in Italy with his family. He made watercolor paintings of other parts of the landscape mostly, scenes from Florence, Milan, Rome. While his most famous paintings were done with oil on canvas rather than watercolor, he did have a very long habit of taking his watercolor painting equipment around with him, especially when he was traveling. I think his watercolor paintings are really underrated. But the reason he would do this is the watercolor equipment was just less cumbersome to take around than the oil on canvas. It was easier for him to paint in watercolor while on the go. So paint in watercolor he did quite often on this and other trips throughout his life. And his watercolor paintings were mostly things he saw when he was out and about. A lot of landscapes, a lot of paintings of famous buildings, and in this case, also a painting of two women probably sitting on a porch. Italian Women. This is an 1884 watercolor painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov painted this during an 1884 tour of Europe where he spent a lot of time in Italy with his family. He made watercolor paintings of other parts of the landscape mostly, scenes from Florence, Milan, Rome. While his most famous paintings were done with oil on canvas rather than watercolor, he did have a very long habit of taking his watercolor painting equipment around with him, especially when he was traveling. I think his watercolor paintings are really underrated. But the reason he would do this is the watercolor equipment was just less cumbersome to take around than the oil on canvas. It was easier for him to paint in watercolor while on the go. so paint and watercolor he did quite often on this and other trips throughout his life. And his watercolor paintings were mostly things he saw when he was out and about. A lot of landscapes, a lot of paintings of famous buildings, and in this case, also a painting of two women probably sitting on a porch. Milan's Cathedral. This is an 1884 painting by Vasily Surikov, depicting, of course, if you could guess, the cathedral in the city of Milan in Italy. This was one of Surikov's travel paintings. This was done in a tour of Europe in 1884 that the artist took with his family. And he spent a lot of time in Italy during this tour. And while in Italy, he did a lot of watercolor paintings of just things he saw around him. He painted things from several different cities, Florence, Milan, of course, Rome. He did a couple watercolor paintings of just regular people he saw out and about. And while this artist is more well known for his large canvas, oil-on-canvas paintings depicting historical events, I think his travel paintings with watercolor paint are really underrated. Because he did do a lot of traveling in his life, and his watercolor paint set became sort of a mobile painting studio where he painted landscapes, cityscapes, anything he saw. And that gave us some pretty nice looking paintings of architecture such as this. Milan's Cathedral. This is an 1884 painting by Vasily Surikov, depicting, of course, if you could guess, the cathedral in the city of Milan in Italy. This was one of Surikov's travel paintings. This was done in a tour of Europe in 1884 that the artist took with his family. And he spent a lot of time in Italy during this tour. And while in Italy, he did a lot of watercolor paintings of just things he saw around him. He painted things from several different cities, Florence, Milan, of course, Rome. He did a couple watercolor paintings of just regular people he saw out and about. And while this artist is more well known for his large canvas, oil-on-canvas paintings depicting historical events, I think his travel paintings with watercolor paint are really underrated. Because he did do a lot of traveling in his life, and his watercolor paint set became sort of a mobile painting studio where he painted landscapes, cityscapes, anything he saw. And that gave us some pretty nice looking paintings of architecture such as this. Naples Embankment. This is an 1884 painting by Vasily Surikov. This painting was done during a tour of Europe that the artist took with his family. He spent his time mostly in Italy during that trip, and he has copious paintings to show for it. He did quite a few paintings of various landscapes and cityscapes mostly, in many of Italy's famous cities, Naples being one of them, along with Florence, Milan, and of course Rome itself. These paintings were done in watercolor. That was a niche talent of this artist. He spent a lot of time traveling, and watercolor was his more portable set of art supplies. So when he was on the road, or even just walking around a city that he lived in, he would very frequently take his watercolor equipment with him and paint whatever he saw, which ranged from people to famous buildings to cityscapes, landscapes, etc. This resulted in some really nice paintings of architecture, and became a nice added skill in Surikov's repertoire, when most other artists were primarily focused on oil and canvas work. Naples Embankment. This is an 1884 painting by Vasily Surikov. This painting was done during a tour of Europe that the artist took with his family. He spent his time mostly in Italy during that trip, and he has copious paintings to show for it. He did quite a few paintings of various landscapes and cityscapes mostly, in many of Italy's famous cities, Naples being one of them, along with Florence, Milan, and of course Rome itself. These paintings were done in watercolor. That was a niche talent of this artist. He spent a lot of time traveling, and watercolor was his more portable set of art supplies. So when he was on the road, or even just walking around a city that he lived in, he would very frequently take his watercolor equipment with him and paint whatever he saw, which ranged from people to famous buildings to cityscapes, landscapes, etc. This resulted in some really nice paintings of architecture, and became a nice added skill in Surikov's repertoire, when most other artists were primarily focused on oil and canvas work. Neapolitan Girl with Flowers in Her Hair. This is an 1884 watercolor painting by Vasily Surikov. This painting was done during a trip to Italy as part of a tour of Europe that he took with his family in that year. He spent, of course, a lot of time in Italy during that time, and over the course of this trip, he spent a lot of time painting. He came out with numerous paintings, mostly of landscapes, cityscapes, famous buildings, places in cities like Rome, Milan, Florence, Naples, other places. But that's not to say he didn't paint people as well. He did. And the thing that sets this a little bit apart is all of this travel painting that he did in watercolor, as opposed to the more traditional, more widely used, more respected, of course, oil on canvas. Watercolor painting was a little more compact, and of course he could make paintings more quickly with it, For that reason, it might not have been as respected a medium as oil on canvas, but it certainly did not take away from his talent with it. Surikov spent a lot of time working in watercolor, made a lot of really good-looking paintings, most of which he did while he was out and about. Neapolitan Girl with Flowers in Her Hair. This is an 1884 watercolor painting by Vasily Surikov. This painting was done during a trip to Italy as part of a tour of Europe that he took with his family in that year. He spent, of course, a lot of time in Italy during that time, and over the course of this trip, he spent a lot of time painting. He came out with numerous paintings, mostly of landscapes, cityscapes, famous buildings, places in cities like Rome, Milan, Florence, Naples, other places. But that's not to say he didn't paint people as well, he did. And the thing that sets this a little bit apart is all of this travel painting that he did in watercolor, as opposed to the more traditional, more widely used, more respected, of course, oil on canvas. Watercolor painting was a little more compact, and of course he could make paintings more quickly with it. For that reason, it might not have been as respected a medium as oil on canvas, but it certainly did not take away from his talent with it. Surikov spent a lot of time working in watercolor, made a lot of really good-looking paintings, most of which he did while he was out and about. Portrait of I.E. Kreshkovsky. This is an 1884 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is a painting that the artist did when he got back from that long trip to Italy that he took. And as for the person in this painting, this was actually a classmate of Surikov's from the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg. Kreshkovsky was also known as a realist painter, but he did more landscapes than anything else. He was born in Poland in 1854, not that much older than Surikov himself, and both of them being known as Russian realist painters, they likely would have known each other over a very long period of time, many years. So it makes sense that they would paint each other at least once. Now, as for this being a portrait, the thing about portrait painting is to tell the viewer not only what the person looked like, but something about their personality as well. So I see in this painting bags under the eyes, a little bloodshot eyes maybe, simple black clothing, solid color background. I take it from this that this guy was probably a loner and maybe a little bit of a workhorse, not really a social butterfly party animal. Portrait of I.S. Ostrikov. This is an 1884 watercolor painting by Vasily Surikov. Ostrikov was another classmate of the artist himself, Surikov, at the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg. Surikov did paintings of multiple of his classmates from that school in this year, 1884. And the thing to keep in mind when you look at portraits is the goal is to show the viewer more than just what the person looked like, but tell you something about their personality as well. And so when Surikov painted Ostrikov, he gave it a bright background. It looks like it might be out in a garden somewhere. And he painted the man doing something that he probably spent a lot of time doing, that is, painting, of course. So if the viewer is trying to imagine what a Saturday with this person might be like, you can probably picture after breakfast, late morning, go out in the garden, look at flowers, look at birds, look at plants, do some painting and talk. Now, apart from being just an artist, this man was also an art collector and a museum curator. So it makes sense that he had a deep appreciation for the visual mediums of artwork. Scenes from a Carnival in Rome. This is an 1884 painting by Vasily Surikov. This was probably inspired by a long trip through Italy that he took earlier in this year. While there, he did a lot of travel painting, mostly in watercolor, mostly landscapes and cityscapes, paintings of architecture. This one, though, was done later in that year, and as opposed to the watercolor painting medium that he used for his travel painting. This one was oil on canvas, meaning he probably took a little bit more time with it. I believe he did this one after returning home from Europe. Surikov is most well known for his historical paintings. He did some works on really huge size canvases, depicting various scenes from Russian history. But I think what he did most often, and probably what he liked doing the most, is just painting things that he saw right in front of him. That's why I think he did a lot of watercolor as opposed to other painters who focus mainly on oil on canvas. And that's also why I think he did a lot of landscapes and cityscapes. They were things that were right in front of him while he was traveling. Scenes from a Carnival in Rome. This is an 1884 painting by Vasily Surikov. This was probably inspired by a long trip through Italy that he took earlier in this year. While there, he did a lot of travel painting, mostly in watercolor, mostly landscapes and cityscapes, paintings of architecture. This one, though, was done later in that year, and as opposed to the watercolor painting medium that he used for his travel painting. This one was oil on canvas, meaning he probably took a little bit more time with it. I believe he did this one after returning home from Europe. Surikov is most well known for his historical paintings. He did some works on really huge size canvases, depicting various scenes from Russian history. But I think what he did most often, and probably what he liked doing the most, is just painting things that he saw right in front of him. That's why I think he did a lot of watercolor as opposed to other painters who focus mainly on oil on canvas. And that's also why I think he did a lot of landscapes and cityscapes. They were things that were right in front of him while he was traveling. St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. This is an 1884 painting by Vasily Surikov. This was done during a tour of Europe that the artist took during that year, during which he spent a lot of time in Italy in particular. And during this trip, he spent a lot of time doing travel paintings of various things that he saw, mostly landscapes and cityscapes, in various Italian cities such as Milan, Florence, of course Rome itself. And thanks to all these travel paintings we have from him, this actually turned out to be one of the most prolific years of the artist's life. The other thing about this is he did it in watercolor as opposed to oil on canvas. Watercolor was a quicker way of painting, but it was less widely used among famous painters. The other thing, though, is that it was harder to get very detailed watercolor images. However, Surikov spent a lot of time practicing that and perfecting his art, mostly through travel painting, not just this year, not just in Italy, but in lots of different places, in cities, on the road, rural places. And he gave us a lot of really great paintings of architecture, such as this. The 1884 self-portrait of Vasily Surikov. I say 1884 because this artist did multiple self-portraits throughout his life. He was in his mid to late 30s when he did this one. And reflecting on his life as I look at this self-portrait, he came a long way at this point. He was born in Siberia, a remote, cold region, nothing really close by except gold mines. Despite that, and despite his father dying when he was young, he got the attention of the right people. He managed to get patronage and donations to pay his way through art school in St. Petersburg, thrived when he got to the big city, spent time in both St. Petersburg and Moscow, developed his art school, met his wife, made a family, made a name for himself both in oil on canvas paintings. He did some huge historical paintings that he's very famous for, as well as a lot of very underrated watercolor paintings, specifically of architecture. More detail in that medium than most people can muster. And now, at this point, he just spent most of the year in Italy with his family. He has come a long way, and things are looking up. Thoughtful Teenager. This is an 1885 painting by Vasily Surikov. And this painting is a study, meaning it's a painting he did in preparation for a larger, more significant painting. Usually something that's incorporated and posed directly into the more significant painting. The more significant painting in question would be finished 2 years after this. That is another one of this artist's large-scale historical paintings that he is very famous for. As for the subject of this painting, and, well, a lot of the people that he has in the background of his paintings, Surikov was a fan of people watching, so when he went out on the town with his watercolors, not only was he paying attention to architecture, landscapes, cityscapes, and painting those, he was also watching the faces of regular people that he saw out and about. And a number of these people's faces made their way into paintings such as this one. In particular, people say the artist liked the somber, pessimistic Russian facial expression of this particular person. Of course, Russians are known for smiling much less often than Americans. Surikov would certainly know. Rooftops in Winter. This is an 1885 painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov was a very visual artist. I know, we're talking about a famous painter, what else is new? But what I mean by that is he painted what he saw directly in front of him very often. Some of his most well-known works are huge canvas historical paintings, painted scenes from Russian history, but the vast majority of his work are landscapes, cityscapes, travel paintings, things that he saw directly in front of him. You can literally follow the timeline of where he lived each year of his life just by looking at the things he painted at which time. And in 1885, he had recently gotten back from a year-long trip in Italy, and he and his family were again living in Moscow. That is presumably where these particular snow-covered roofs are located. And the thing that stands out with this painting as opposed to this artist's other paintings, a lot of his cityscapes were watercolor. This one is oil on canvas. Reason being, watercolor was easier to go out and about with and paint with in public. I imagine during the winter he might have been sitting at home and looking out his window while painting this. Village Altarpiece. This is an 1885 painting by Vasily Surikov, and this depicts an altarpiece, which is, of course, a view of the altar of a local village Russian Orthodox church. You can see the altar itself, you can see lamps, incense holders, and of course the icons. Icons, of course, being religious paintings that are worshipped as a form of worshipping the person that those paintings depict. It could be Jesus, Mary, the saints. The icons are, of course, hung in frames behind the altar on the wall. A scene from everyday life in 1880s rural Russia. Now, the impressive thing about this painting is that it was done in watercolor rather than oil on canvas. Watercolor not being a medium that many of the famous artists use very often. But it was sort of a specialty for Surikov. He spent a lot of time using watercolor to paint things that he saw right in front of him. And over the years, he gained more and more skill with it, being able to depict things in this medium with more detail than most people could ever hope to attain. So look, observe, enjoy. Wacky, Seated on the Snow. This is an 1885 painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov was mostly known for his large canvas historical paintings, canvases that were taller than a person both in height and width. And this painting is a study piece for one of those big historical paintings that he would finish in 1887, 2 years later. Study piece meaning he painted this in preparation for painting some smaller piece of that larger painting. So the person in this painting does appear in his larger piece, Boyarinya Morozova. I will cover that painting in due time. Surikov was part of the realist art movement, and I like to think of realism as being somewhat similar to the romanticist movement. The thing with realist painters is emotional honesty. They painted what they saw without embellishment, without glorifying or romanticizing anything. And so, rather than this man's facial expression and emotions being stereotypical what you would expect from someone witnessing something shocking, Surikov tried to be as human as possible, warts and all, when painting figures such as this one. Wanderer. This is an 1885 painting by Vasily Surikov. This one is known as a study painting, meaning it's a painting he did in preparation for painting a part of a much larger painting. In this case, it was a painting he finished in 1887, 2 years after this one. And the man in this painting will be included in that 1887 painting. And as far as getting the faces for all the people in these huge paintings, Surikov was somewhat of a people watcher. He very much loved painting what he saw with his watercolors. He did a lot of landscapes and cityscapes, things that were in his immediate vicinity when he was just out and about. But he also captured the faces of random people who he saw in public, and used some of those in these paintings. This is likely one of those. And when we talk about the larger paintings that these study works would contribute to, Surikov took the word large quite literally. The canvas sizes on some of these were taller and wider than a human being. And the huge paintings he was most famous for were scenes from Russian history. Head of a Woman in a Black Shawl. This is an 1886 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is another study piece that Surikov did, meaning it is a painting that he did in preparation for a piece of a larger painting. So the woman you see in this painting is indeed included in a future painting that Surikov did. This was part of one of his large historical paintings that he was most famous for. And when I say large, I mean large, over 10 feet both tall and wide. He was known for making huge oil-on-canvas creations depicting various scenes from Russian history. And although he did a lot of landscapes, cityscapes, other watercolor work in his time, he was best known for his oil-on-canvas, huge canvas historical works. Surikov was part of the realist art movement, meaning rather than glorifying or romanticizing any particular scene or emotion, his goal was emotional honesty, portraying things as they really were. He strove to make a genuine human feeling here, which makes it even more interesting to look at the face, look into the eyes, and try to guess what this person... Kneeling Beggar. This is an 1886 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is what's known as a study painting, meaning it was painted in preparation for painting one segment of a larger painting. The painting in question was finished a year after this in 1887, but this is far from the first study painting that he did for that particular piece. Surikov was well known for his large canvas historical paintings, and by large canvas I mean almost 10 feet high and more than 10 feet across. Paintings that depicted scenes from Russian history. The artist became very well known for these, and this is not the first one he's done either. In fact, he spent 2 years working on it, making study pieces for various people that he would put in the painting. Sometimes he would ask people he knew to sit for him and model the faces of the people in the painting off of the person that was sitting. Sometimes he would just go out in public and people watch on the street and paint the faces of people he saw. And this massive amount of effort would all come together into something that brought a single intense moment in history to full life. The Old Woman with a Patterned Headscarf. This is an 1886 painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov was part of the realist art movement. And Russian realism, you can think of it as sort of a response to over-glorification and over-romanticization of things in art. And in Russia, especially if you're familiar with an Orthodox Church icon paintings that are meant to literally be sacred enough for people to pray to. Realism is a contrast to that. It's a return to showing things as they are, warts and all. And that's especially true when you look at people. Just look at the faces that these artists painted. Try to read the emotions on their faces. This old woman with a headscarf looks like someone you might encounter in an Orthodox church on some Sunday. And in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, there were a lot of famous Russian artists who were a part of this art movement. In fact, a lot of them were classmates of each other in the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg. Surikov himself attended there during the 1870s. Young lady, this is an 1886 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is what's known as a study painting, meaning it's a painting he did in preparation for painting a piece of a much larger and more significant work. And by larger and more significant, we mean one of the huge canvas paintings that he was famous for. He did these in oil on canvas, and he painted various scenes from Russian history. These canvases he used were often both taller and wider than a human being. The particular piece that this one is for would be finished in 1887, the year after, but this is far from the first study piece he's done for this. He put an immense amount of work into these huge paintings. This one in particular, he spent 2 years making various study pieces on for various people depicted in the painting. And the people whose faces he used in the study piece, these models ranged anywhere from friends and family who he asked to sit for him, to random people who he saw out and about and he just sketched down what their face looked like real quick. Dubovsky Boulevard in winter. This is an 1886 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is a place from Moscow, which is where the artist was living at the time. And Surikov most often painted things that he saw directly in front of him. He did a lot of landscape and cityscape paintings like this one. And the fact that he did paint this means he probably went through this part of the city pretty frequently. Now, this painting is oil on canvas as opposed to watercolor, which for his landscapes he used more often. Not as many famous painters were as purposeful in using watercolor for their paintings as Surikov was. And I think how that started was Surikov did a lot of traveling. Initially, he grew up in Siberia and he went to art school in St. Petersburg. So in his 20s, he spent a lot of time sitting in a wagon. And that probably lent a lot of time to painting, which with a watercolor setup, it is easier to set up, less cumbersome than an oil on canvas setup, which was more popular, more traditional. And then, even after graduating art school, getting married, staying in Moscow, he just never stopped using watercolor to paint things that he saw in front of him. Landscapes, cityscapes, everything. Boyarinya Morozova. This is an 1887 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is the culmination of at least 2 years of work and a lot of study sketches. In fact, having looked at all the study paintings before this one, it's fun to look through and pick out all the people that I recognize from those study paintings. Boyarinya Morozova is the name of the central figure who you see on the cart in this painting, the one dressed in black. This painting shows her arrest in 1671. She would later die of starvation in prison. She is known for standing up to and disagreeing with some church reforms instituted by one of the Orthodox Church patriarchs, one of which was the 2-finger sign of the cross as opposed to the newer 3-finger sign of the cross. You can see her and a few other people in this painting as well holding up those 2 fingers as a symbol of defiance to those church reforms. And this is an interesting setting to think about. It mirrors some of the stories from the Protestant Reformation that was going on in Western Europe around the same century. The Christianity of Eastern Europe was not completely monolithic. Portrait of E.A. Surikova. This is an 1887 painting by Vasily Surikov. It is a portrait he did of his wife. Now, the first thing to know about portraits, as always, the goal is not just to show the viewer what the person looked like, but to tell the viewer something about this person's personality through the painting. Now, given that information, and given that this person is the artist's wife, I was a little bit surprised, didn't quite know what to make of the fact that this painting has her in such plain clothes, such a neutral expression, and such a blank background. One would think when they hear the idea that this would turn out to be a love letter painted but not written with words. And instead we get an image that is blank in everything except her. And that's when it sorta clicked for me. In a way, this could be that kind of love letter. It could be a statement from the artist that everything else fades away. You could be tired, you could have your hair tied up to do housework, and still, the most beautiful, interesting thing in the world from the artist's perspective is his wife's face. Portrait of N.P. Pasek. This is an 1887 watercolor painting by Vasily Surikov. And as always, when we look at portraits, we must remember that the goal of the portrait is to not just show what the person looked like, but to tell something about their personality through the painting. And in this one, that statement rings as true as it can ever be. Because we don't know much at all about this man, except that Surikov made a portrait of him. And because the vast majority of the painting itself is of the background, not of the actual subject of the portrait. He is just one person taking up a small segment of this painting, not even in the middle, in the corner of this vast dining table. So right away, that tells us something about him. He is an entertainer. Not public spectacle type of entertainer, but house guest type of entertainer. He enjoys playing host and giving lavish dinner parties. He enjoys curating evening experiences for friends and acquaintances. Preparing everything for one of these evenings and seeing it go off without a hitch was probably the best part of this man's week almost every week. Portrait of P.F. Surikova. This is an 1887 painting by Vasily Surikov. This was done in the same year that the artist did a portrait of his wife as well. And in both of those paintings, the women are in very plain black clothes, and the portrait had a monochrome background. This is out of the ordinary for most portraits. One of the first things to know about painting portraits is the goal is to tell the viewer not just what the person looked like, but something about their personality as well. And that's hard to do if you don't have a scene or a setting that the person being painted is a part of in the portrait. Even other portraits from this same artist of other people have more lively, more animated, complex backgrounds than these two did. But the thing they have in common with each other is they are close family members and they were done in the same year. So I think the lack of a background or the lack of any distractions in the clothing was partly a statement by the artist to ignore any other distractions from the person themselves. Like saying the person is interesting and important enough for their face alone to tell you something about their life. Portrait of P.F. Surikova. This is an 1887 painting by Vasily Surikov. This was done in the same year that the artist did a portrait of his wife as well. And in both of those paintings, the women are in very plain black clothes, and the portrait had a monochrome background. This is out of the ordinary for most portraits. One of the first things to know about painting portraits is the goal is to tell the viewer not just what the person looked like, but something about their personality as well. And that's hard to do if you don't have a scene or a setting that the person being painted is a part of in the portrait. Even other portraits from this same artist of other people have more lively, more animated, complex backgrounds than these two did. But the thing they have in common with each other is they are close family members and they were done in the same year. So I think the lack of a background or the lack of any distractions in the clothing was partly a statement by the artist to ignore any other distractions from the person themselves. Like saying the person is interesting and important enough for their face alone to tell you something about their life. Young Lady with the Blue Fur Coat. This is an 1887 painting by Vasily Surikov. And this is a study painting, meaning it's one he did in preparation for a larger, more significant work. Surikov was most known for his large canvas historical paintings detailing various scenes from Russian history. When I say large canvas, these canvases were often both taller and wider than the height of a human being. And a lot of time went into his process for creating these pieces. He did numerous sketch studies for each one. These studies are basically practice paintings for people that he intended to show in the final painting. Now, as far as how he would get the faces of the people in these studies, sometimes he would have friends or family members sit and pose for his paintings. Other times he would go out in public and just people watch and paint the people he saw. He spent a lot of time living in Moscow, so he had plenty of time to go out, observe random people on the street, and get a collection of strangers' faces, Russian faces, for him to put in these paintings of Russian history. Portrait of Olga Surikova. This is an 1888 painting by Vasily Surikov. He did this one oil on canvas, and the girl in the painting is, of course, his own daughter. This is not the first painting of her that he's done. She is, of course, a couple years older at this point. I find it interesting at this point in this artist's career, looking at which paintings he did in oil on canvas as opposed to watercolor, because he was skilled in both. He did spend a lot of time in both. He started out doing mostly only landscapes and cityscapes in watercolor, but he grew into doing some pretty good portraits as well. But at the same time, oil on canvas has always been a more traditional, more respected medium, more time-intensive as well to make a painting. And for his own family, he tends to more often do oil on canvas. Probably because he wants a more professional-looking final product, not because his watercolors aren't professional-looking, they're actually very good. But in terms of what a visitor would see if he has a house guest over, if they look at this painting on a wall, oil on canvas would be more impressive than watercolor. House of the Surikov family in Krasnoyarsk. This is an 1890 painting by Vasily Surikov. Krasnoyarsk, if you were wondering, is in Siberia. It is north of Mongolia and northeast of Kazakhstan. So safe to say it is pretty far out of the way from most of the major population centers in Russia at the time. But this is where his family lived, this is where the artist grew up. He did this painting in watercolor, which, as a matter of fact, some of the first watercolor paintings he did were on the road going to and from Siberia and St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg being where he attended art school. One of the reasons he used watercolor was because it was easier to transport, easier to paint on the go. And even when he lived stationary in a city, he would often go out somewhere and paint a cityscape with watercolor. Most famous artists focused mainly on oil and canvas, so Surikov was a little bit of an outlier in this regard, but we can be thankful he used watercolor so much because it gave us some pretty great paintings of architecture. And as he developed his skill, he even did some watercolor portraits as well. Portrait of K.M. Verkoturova. This is an 1890 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is a watercolor painting that he did during one of his visits to the town where he grew up in Siberia. He and his wife had been living in Moscow before this. Surikov is most known for his large canvas, oil-on-canvas historical paintings, but I actually really like his watercolor portraits. And what's fun about this one is we don't know much about the person in the portrait other than the fact that they were painted by Surikov. So let's dig into it. The first thing to know about portraits is the goal of a portrait is to tell the viewer not just what the person looked like, but something about their personality as well. And the first thing I notice about this woman is she's hunched over a desk looking at a piece of paper. So I can assume she's a fan of reading. From the way that she's dressed, I can guess that she might be not upper class, not lower class, but probably around middle class in terms of wealth. She might be related to a gold miner or a fur trapper. Those are the two big things that were going on in Siberia at the time. Interesting depiction of someone that the artist knew. Portrait of young Leonid Chernyshev. This is an 1890 painting by Vasily Surikov. Chernyshev grew up near the same hometown where Surikov himself grew up. He was 15 years old at the time that this painting was made, and he would later go on to have a long friendship with the artist Surikov. This painting is actually one of a series of paintings of people in his hometown that Surikov did during this year. This was during a visit to his hometown in Siberia, which was pretty far away from Moscow and St. Petersburg, where he lived before. Chernyshev, though, 2 years after this painting, would likewise make his way out of Siberia and go to study in Western Russia. He studied art in Moscow. After finishing school there, he would come back to his hometown in Krasnoyarsk, where he made a name for himself as an architect in that Siberian city. He would keep on living until 1932, when he died at the age of 57. Portrait of young woman in fur coat with muff. This is an 1890 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is a year when Surikov was visiting the place where he grew up in Siberia. Of course, he would escape his small town, go to art school in St. Petersburg, get married, live in Moscow, have a big tour of Europe, and now he was returning and making a big trip of it. He did several paintings during this time, including a lot of portraits of various people from that town, both people that he knew and influential people from the community. This portrait, though, is no particular person, just a young woman in a fur coat with a muff, which almost makes me wonder if he wasn't drawing this for any particular purpose, just for the sake of beauty more than anything else, and also to illustrate something someone might see going around his home area in the year 1890. Which, if you think about it, it's a really neat time capsule. It's like a glimpse of a part of history from someone who lived it. Not really any magnificent historical event, but just a picture of something from everyday life, just from someone who walked around there. It's a neat connection to the past. Executioner. This is an 1891 sketch by Vasily Surikov. The sketch depicts, of course, a public execution. This is what's known as a study work, meaning it was done in preparation for a larger and more significant work. The artist Surikov was most well known for his huge canvas, oil-on-canvas paintings. When I say huge canvas, I mean both taller and wider than the height of a human being. And these huge canvas paintings most often depicted various scenes from Russian history. Surikov would actually spend multiple years preparing for each one of these paintings that he did, and that included a lot of study paintings. And you can think of that as basically like practice paintings of various people that would be incorporated and posed into the actual painting. Now, as far as where he got the faces of these people, sometimes he would ask friends or family to sit for him while he painted them. Other times, he would go out in the city and sketch or paint the faces of random people. He was kind of a people watcher that way. But it resulted in some timeless pieces of art. Room in Surikov's house. This is an 1890 painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov is most well known for his huge canvas, oil-on-canvas paintings. Most of these depict various scenes from Russian history, and he spent years preparing for each one of them. But in between, he did loads upon loads of watercolor paintings. When he lived in a city, he went out on the sidewalk and painted various cityscapes with his watercolor set. When he traveled, he took his trusty watercolor set with him and painted on the road. He painted portraits of family, he painted portraits of random people. This watercolor habit of his has given us some really underrated paintings of famous architecture, such as the Colosseum in Rome, the Moscow cityscape early on when they first got electric. Also, at times, paintings of people who were young in their teens and 20s, before they went on to become influential in their own communities. Mostly when he was doing watercolor, he painted whatever he happened to see in front of him. And in this case, he most literally painted whatever he saw in front of him by painting a room in his own house, which still turned out beautifully. Portrait of T.K. Domogilova. This is an 1891 painting by Vasily Surikov. He did this one in oil on canvas. This was a time when Surikov was living back in the town where he grew up in Siberia. And during this time, he did a lot of portraits of various people around the town and the community. We don't know very much about very many of these people, and that includes this one here. So let's go over the first thing we pay attention to when we look at portraits. That is, portraits are meant to show the viewer more than just what the person looked like, but also communicate something about the subject's life and personality. So here we're looking at a woman, and the most obvious thing is the beekeeping outfit she's wearing. Yes, that's probably one of her biggest hobbies. Probably one of the places where she spends most of her time. If you could only have one or maybe a handful of images painted of you throughout your entire life, what would you want these images telling people about you and how you lived? Well, she chose beekeeping. And the other thing is her smile, especially in a Russian context. That tells me she had a really positive outlook on life. Siberian Beauty, portrait of E.A. Reshkovsky. This is an 1891 painting by Vasily Surikov. This painting was done after Surikov moved back to his hometown where he grew up in Siberia, after about a decade and a half of living elsewhere in Moscow, St. Petersburg, other places. This was a homecoming for him, and he used it to paint lots of portraits of lots of different people in town. And most of these people that he painted, we know almost nothing about them, except that he painted them. So with that in mind, let's remind ourselves, the purpose of portraiture as a form of painting is to tell the viewer not just what the person looked like, but also something about the person's personality and their life. This looks like an unmarried young woman, both by that her face looks sort of young, and by the title of the painting having Siberian Beauty in it. She's wearing a head covering. That could be because of the cold, or it could be because of religious reasons. She has a smile, which is uncommon in Russian painting. This could tell us that she had an optimistic view on life, or she was fun to be around. And by her clothing, I would guess that she was probably comfortably middle class. Taking a Snowy Town. This is an 1891 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is one of his huge canvas paintings, which he was very well known for. Most of those paintings depicted scenes from Russian history. This one, however, rather than depicting history, was a scene from the artist's hometown. During his childhood, one of the games that the kids would play in the Siberian town of Krasnoyarsk was called, of course, Taking a Snowy Town. In this game, they would build a fortress or a town out of ice and snow. One team would be on offense, one team would be on defense, and of course the goal was to either take or defend the town. Just what I can see from his paintings, 1890 and 91 were years when the author was really getting back to his roots. It feels like he was finding himself again after living for a while in the big Russian cities and in Europe. And now he's back home, he's painting familiar things from his hometown, and he's sort of resetting, it feels like, finding a new life direction. And as part of that, he ends up painting this, which is sort of a homage to his childhood and a homage to his home. Cossack Rower. This is an 1892 study painting by Vasily Surikov. It looks like he did this one in a combination of pencil and oil on canvas. And when I say study painting, it means that this is something that was done in preparation for a larger, more significant painting. The larger, more significant painting in question is titled Conquest of Siberia by Yermak, which this artist would finish later on. Study paintings like this were very common for Surikov to do. He is most known for his large canvas historical paintings. By large canvas, I mean taller and wider than the height of a human being. And historical paintings, those are the oil on canvas paintings he did that depict various scenes from Russian history. In this case, it is the time when the Cossacks claimed Siberia for the Russian Empire. Surikov did a handful of these paintings throughout his life, and each one of these, being so big, took an amount of prep work to match its size. He would spend multiple years doing study paintings to get every single one just right. And it paid off because each one became extremely famous. Girl with a Red Jacket. This is an 1892 painting by Vasily Surikov. This was a time when the artist was living back in his hometown where he grew up after a long period of living away in various cities. It was a time of recentering and reorienting for him after some big life changes. And this is very much reflected in the artwork he did at this time. For instance, he did a big oil on canvas work of just children playing. And he did lots of portraits, both oil and in watercolor, of various people throughout the town. Which leads us to this one, which is a watercolor painting of no one in particular, just an unnamed person. But at the same time, someone representative of that Siberian town, Krasnoyarsk. It's a face similar enough to the people one might have seen in that town, that the artist decided to paint this one just for the sake of painting it. Sort of like painting to find the visible beauty in the world and the people around you, at a time when other things in your life are pretty confusing or pretty British. This is an 1892 painting by Vasily Surikov. This one was done oil on canvas. This was another study painting of his. This painting he did in preparation for his larger, more significant piece, Yermak's Conquest of Siberia, which wouldn't be finished until 1895, 3 years later. And yes, spending multiple years working on a huge oil on canvas piece like that was typical for Surikov. Reason being, when I say huge, I mean that these canvases were both taller and wider than the height of a human being. He did a good handful of these huge canvas pieces throughout his lifetime, and these are what he is most famous for. Most often with these, he painted various scenes from Russian history. Before this, he did a famous day of execution after an uprising, as well as the arrest of a famous religious figure. With Yermak's Conquest of Siberia, though, he painted the speedy grabbing up of vast quantities of barely hospitable land. This was a time of huge expansion for Russia. British. This is an 1892 painting by Vasily Surikov. This one was done oil on canvas. This was another study painting of his. This painting he did in preparation for his larger, more significant piece, Yermak's Conquest of Siberia, which wouldn't be finished until 1895, 3 years later. And yes, spending multiple years working on a huge oil on canvas piece like that was typical for Surikov. Reason being, when I say huge, I mean that these canvases were both taller and wider than the height of a human being. He did a good handful of these huge canvas pieces throughout his lifetime, and these are what he is most famous for. Most often with these, he painted various scenes from Russian history. Before this, he did a famous day of execution after an uprising, as well as the arrest of a famous religious figure. With Yermak's Conquest of Siberia, though, he painted the speedy grabbing up of vast quantities of barely hospitable land. This was a time of huge expansion for Russia. Portrait of L.T. Maturina, Cossack woman. This is an 1892 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is an oil on canvas portrait. This is one of many portraits he did during the early 1890s. This was a time shortly after the artist's wife passed away. The artist during this year was living in the town where he grew up in Siberia. So this was very much a time of reconnecting with his roots and finding a new life direction for his new chapter of life. Surikov was always fond of painting things that he saw directly in front of him, and during 1891 and 92, that meant painting lots of portraits of lots of friends and acquaintances from around town. So Surikov left us with a record of what lots of various people in the town of Krasnoyarsk in Siberia looked like. This is also a recognition of the Cossack roots of both the artist and the place. The Cossack people were the ones that were paid by the Russian emperors to conquer and tame Siberia, and their descendants during the 19th century were largely the ones who populated. Portrait of young woman with kokoshnik. This is an 1892 painting by Vasily Surikov. This one was done oil on canvas. Surikov at this time was living in the town where he grew up, that is the town of Krasnoyarsk in Siberia, and he spent the early 1890s doing a lot of portraits of various people in the town, friends, family, acquaintances, as well as influential people around town. This one, though, is not anyone in particular that we know of. Rather, this seems more like a celebration of the artist's Russian heritage, through displaying an element of traditional Russian dress, that is the kokoshnik, that is the headdress that this woman is wearing. The fact that this is an oil on canvas painting too is also significant. That signals maybe a little more thought and time was put into this than some of his other watercolor paintings, which Surikov was great at bringing detail out through watercolor, don't get me wrong. But as a medium, oil on canvas is for work that takes a little bit longer and is taken a little more seriously. Cossack Dmitry Sokol. This is an 1893 painting by Vasily Surikov. This was an oil on canvas painting that he did during a period of a few years when he was living in the town he grew up in, Krasnoyarsk in Siberia. These few years were a time when he was working on one of his huge canvas, oil on canvas historical paintings, that one detailing the conquest of Siberia by the Cossacks. So this painting could be a nice blend of two different projects he was working on at the time, the one being doing several study paintings for that bigger painting, study paintings being practice paintings for various segments of that painting, and the other project being several portraits that he did of various friends, acquaintances, and people from around town. The face of this person could easily have been modeled off of someone that he knew in that town, but as far as who it is, we don't really know much about the name that is attached to the person in this painting. So this could be the face of a contemporary to him, Cossack Siberian, imagined in the historical context of someone from the same ethnic group and place, but a little earlier on in history. Herd of horses in the Baraba steppes. This is an 1895 landscape painting by Vasily Surikov. The first thing that catches my attention with this is most of his landscapes before this point were watercolor rather than oil on canvas. Surikov spent a lot more time working in watercolor paint than the average artist. Did a lot of paintings of landscapes and cityscapes, a lot of architecture paintings, even a good handful of portraits in watercolor. He used watercolor for a lot of those mainly because it was portable. He was big on painting things directly in front of him that he could see physically right there. And watercolor paint, for someone who traveled as much as he did, lent itself well to that kind of lifestyle. This one, though, he was living in Siberia at the time. A herd of horses on the steppe plains is probably something he saw firsthand in the year 1895. He did a lot of paintings during this time, mainly trying to reorient himself and finding a new life direction. And this one, I think he painted mostly for the sake of beauty and for the sake of painting something that he saw right in front of him. The standard with the Mendelian kept in the armory of the Moscow Kremlin. This is an 1895 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is a study painting that he did in preparation for his larger, more significant painting, Conquest of Siberia by Yermak. That was one of his large canvas historical paintings that he was well known for. He spent years preparing for each of those large paintings, did a handful of those in his lifetime, and that includes several study paintings done for each one. So in these study paintings, usually it's something that the artist would impose into the larger painting. This painting depicts a banner, obviously. This banner is typically kept in the Moscow Kremlin as per the title of the painting. And the word Mendelian in the title of the painting translates to image not made by human hands. In other words, the banner depicts the image on the Shroud of Turin, which is the cloth that Jesus had his face wiped with on his way to the crucifixion, the cloth that had an image of his face supernaturally put on it. Yermak's Conquest of Siberia. This is an 1895 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is one of his huge canvas paintings that he spent several years working on. Common to almost all of these huge canvas paintings he did, they depict scenes from Russian history. Surikov, in fact, was born and grew up in Siberia, so having been specifically from that part of Russia, this particular part of history would have been applicable to him. Likely he would have been descended from at least some of the Cossacks that went and fought in some of these various wars to tame the Tatar steppe lands. During these military conflicts, the Russians paid groups of Cossack mercenaries to do the fighting for them, and they claimed new land at remarkable speed. I read somewhere they claimed an area the size of Belgium every year on average at one point. This is mostly because the Cossacks had gunpowder and the native Siberians had bows and arrows, which you can see the power imbalance of military technology in this painting. Almost all the native tribes eventually died out. Head of Baptized Soldier. This is an 1897 painting by Vasily Surikov. This painting was a study painting, meaning it was something that was painted in preparation for a larger and more significant painting. The more significant painting in question is Suvorov Crossing the Alps. That is a painting that Surikov would finish 2 years after this study painting, and 100 years after the actual historical event that's depicted. It was not unusual for Surikov to make lots and lots of study paintings in preparation for those large paintings. In fact, some of the things he's best known for are his huge canvas historical paintings. Canvases both taller and wider than the height of a human being, and paintings that depict various scenes from Russian history. Surikov has lots and lots of lesser-known watercolor works that are no less good, but his historical paintings are what he's known for. Old Soldier Descending from a Snowy Mountain. This is an 1898 painting by Vasily Surikov. This one was done in oil on canvas in preparation for a larger oil on canvas painting by him that would be completed the following year, 1899. So this is what's called a study painting. It's a painting that's made in preparation for a larger, more significant painting. And very often, especially with Surikov, these paintings would be imposed into the larger painting. And in fact, this study painting also had a study painting of it. He started off by painting just the soldier's head. That was a previous painting, Head of a Baptized Soldier. And now we see the soldier's entire body coming down from the snow. There were a lot of places where Surikov looked for the models of the faces of the people in his paintings. He had friends and family model for him a lot of times, sit and have him paint their faces. But also somewhat often, especially in the 1870s and 80s, he would go out, take a walk around the city, and then just paint the faces of random people who he saw. So some of those people might not even be aware that they ended up as an extra in one of his large-scale paintings. Russian troops under Suvorov crossing the Alps. This is an 1899 painting by Vasily Surikov, oil on canvas. And you can see where he incorporated that one soldier from his study painting into this one and imposed him in there. One of the things Surikov was most well known for was painting scenes from Russian history, usually on huge oil on canvas canvases. This one he did relatively late in his career, painted for the 100-year anniversary of the event which it depicts. The event itself was a group of 20,000 Russian soldiers in 1799 going to join up with an allied military coalition in Switzerland to then go fight in France. 1799, of course, was during the French Revolution, and not too many years later, Napoleon would come to power. Russians would end up fighting against Napoleon as well, and then they would fight against the French again in the Crimean War. So coming out of the time of Peter the Great and then Catherine the Great, when French language and culture was permeating Russia, we now have like 2 generations in a row of Russians fighting the French in various... Big masquerade with Peter the Great on the streets of Moscow, 1722. This is a painting done in watercolor by Vasily Surikov in the year 1900. Surikov was most known for his large-scale oil-on-canvas historical paintings. This one, though, is watercolor, which fewer famous artists used frequently. But Surikov put a lot of time into developing a talent for watercolor art. And at this point in his life, this is later on in his career, he was pretty good at getting detailed watercolor paintings of various different styles of painting. This is a scene from Russian history which is very in character for Surikov. And Peter I, Peter the Great, the big thing to know about him is westernization. He looked at Western Europe, he liked what he saw, and he tried to import a lot of aspects of that culture into Russia. And that fed into things like a lot of the Russian nobility speaking French. The parade depicted in this painting is an example of something Peter the Great did to try and introduce and popularize some of those cultural aspects with the people. Empress Anna Leonovna in the Peterhof Temple shoots deer. This painting was done in the year 1900 by Vasily Surikov. This painting was done in watercolor, which Surikov had an unusual talent for. Most famous painters deal primarily with oil on canvas. Surikov, though, was well known for his paintings depicting various scenes from Russian history, and Russian history this is. Princess Anna here was a niece of the famous Peter the Great. The time of this painting was around the decade of the 1730s. She was known for going against the grain of courtly manners a little bit. She was a bit of a tomboy. Her interests were not fancy events and ball gowns. Her interest was shooting. And that she did. This is the Peterhof Temple. She actually had a segment of these grounds fenced in and had it stocked with lots of large game animals, where, just like this, she would shoot from the balcony. And there was one particular summer, 1739, where she took down 9 deer, 4 boars, and various other large game. Also, hundreds of rabbits and ducks. Naples. This is a watercolor painting done by Vasily Surikov in the year 1900. Surikov was most well known for his oil-on-canvas paintings, especially his large ones that depicted various historical scenes from Russian history. But something underrated that he did very often was watercolor painting, especially of landscapes and cityscapes. Watercolors were easier to travel with and quicker to paint with, which made it very, very convenient for travel painting. Early on in his painting career, he painted Moscow, he painted various landscapes from Siberia. He went on a long tour of Italy in 1884 and painted lots of cityscapes from various cities in that country. In the 1890s, he went a little while without doing much traveling or much watercolor. The artist was recovering from the death of his wife, and during that time, he actually spent a lot of time working on those big historical oil-on-canvas paintings. But now, turn to the century, 1900, he is back at it in Italy. Pretty impressive cityscape of Naples, and he still has a knack for that detailed brushwork that he spent a lot of time practicing and refining. Self-Portrait of Vasily Surikov. This was an oil-on-canvas painting that he did in 1902. He was 54 years old at the time of this painting, and he had already done a lot with his life. Raised himself out of poverty in a small Siberian town by means of his artwork, by the way. Got the attention of a governor and a wealthy patron. With their help, he paid his way through art school in St. Petersburg, painted lots of very well-known paintings and lots of not-so-well-known paintings as well. Traveled the world, got married, had a daughter, and then his wife died. And in the 1890s, he spent a lot of that time back in his hometown in Siberia, still working on painting both scenes from Russian history and things from around his hometown, but not as prolifically as he used to. Now, 1902, this is a little over a decade after that huge transition in his life. And you can see in his facial expression here a little bit about all he's gained and all he's lost. Maybe not specifics if you didn't know the story beforehand, but you would see enough to know that he's been through quite a bit for someone in his 50s. Townswoman, Portrait of Alexandra. This is a 1902 oil-on-canvas painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov did a fair number of portraits, and they weren't always done with oil on canvas. He was also a big fan of using watercolor for painting, which the big 19th century artists don't usually spend a lot of time with watercolor. Surikov did, but this painting was not watercolor, this one was oil on canvas. Surikov did not usually get super imaginative with the subjects of his paintings. He tended to paint either historical events, which the actual historical text could be sort of like an instruction book for what to paint on the canvas, or else he painted things that he saw right in front of him. That is one of the ways he differs from some of the other Russian realist painters. Yaroshenko painted Life is Everywhere, Ilya Repin painted They Did Not Expect Him. Surikov, though, painted landscapes and cityscapes and portraits and scenes from history. He was less one for weaving stories into his paintings. Rather, he painted the beauty that his own eyes showed him. Stepan Razin. This is a 1906 painting by Vasily Surikov. Razin, the man in the painting, was a 17th century Cossack who rebelled against the Tsar. This rebellion was crushed, of course, but it became a long-lasting symbol of resistance against oppression. The man himself ended up becoming a folk hero for Siberian Cossacks, of which the artist Surikov was one. He grew up in Siberia, worked his way towards going to art school in St. Petersburg, and throughout his career he painted a lot of paintings that focused both on wider Russian history in general, as well as more than a few that focused specifically on Cossack Siberian history, of which this is one. So although Razin was not successful in what he did leave a lasting cultural impact. He's remembered in folk songs and in paintings like this one. Portrait of Alexander Suvorov. This is a 1907 painting by Vasily Surikov. This was done on oil on canvas. This is a famous figure from Russian history. Suvorov was, in fact, one of the few generals in world history to be undefeated in over 60 battles. He was active during the latter half of the 18th century. And in fact, Surikov already painted a different painting that somewhat had to do with him. That was the 1899 painting Suvorov crossing the Alps, depicting his troops crossing a snowy mountain range on their way to meet an Allied military coalition in 1799. Surikov, the artist, often painted various scenes from Russian history, and often specifically things that had to do with his own Siberian Cossack heritage. He was skilled in painting both oil on canvas and watercolor paintings. More often he used oil on canvas for his more significant historical paintings, and the fact that he painted more than one painting having to do with his general means he probably looked up to or had some kind of admiration for this figure. Portrait of E.N. Sabashnikova. This is a 1907 painting by Vasily Surikov. The artist Surikov did a lot of portraits of various people in the latter half of his career, and most of these people we don't really know much about them other than they were painted by him. Some of them might have been for friends and family, a lot of them were probably commissioned works. This one was done in oil on canvas as opposed to watercolor. Surikov, in contrast to a lot of other artists of his time, spent a lot of time developing a talent for watercolor painting. He was very skilled in both watercolor and oil on canvas. View of Moscow. This is a 1908 painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov, during the first half of his career, did a lot of landscape and cityscape paintings, and very often he would do these in watercolor as opposed to oil on canvas. He had a habit of painting things that were right in front of him that he could see as he was painting. And watercolor lent itself well to this because he also spent a lot of time traveling, and the equipment for setting up a watercolor painting was less cumbersome than that of an oil on canvas painting. During the latter half of his career, he focused a lot more on oil on canvas, did a lot more oil on canvas work, a lot more portraits, and he put more time into his large canvas historical paintings. And here with this painting, we still see him painting things that are right in front of him that he can see. He spent a lot of time living among 3 different places. Those are Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the town in Siberia where he grew up, Krasnoyarsk. But as opposed to doing this watercolor, he did it oil on canvas, even though it was less detailed than a lot of his other cityscape paintings. Grenada, Alhambra. This is a 1910 painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov was certainly more well known for his large canvas, oil on canvas historical paintings, mostly with scenes from Russian history. But some of his paintings that I appreciate most are his watercolor landscapes and cityscapes. The artist was a man who did quite a lot of traveling during his life, and when he was traveling, the things he painted were usually watercolor as opposed to oil on canvas. This is because watercolor paint equipment was just easier to travel with overall. And with it, he gave us some great scenes, in particular from the Siberian steppes, and quite a lot of paintings from various cities all around Italy from when he did a tour of that country in the 1880s. Quite often, the things he chose to paint were things that happened to be right in front of him at the time. This painting was done later on in his career. This is the Alhambra Palace in the city of Granada, Spain. A lifetime of working with watercolor has given him this ability to manipulate texture, shadows, and color on paper. Portrait of Dr. A.D. Yezersky. This is a 1910 painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov did a lot of portrait work in his later years. Many of them I skipped over. This one caught my eye. The thing to remember about portraits is the goal is to show the viewer not just what the person looked like, but to tell them something about the person's personality as well. And this portrait, with the scenery and the added details, does that very nicely. This is the man as he would have looked when someone came into his office on a weekday. This is how the people who talk to him on a daily or a weekly basis would have known him. You can just picture a group of people standing talking at his funeral saying stuff like, remember how he always had a cigarette in his hand? Remember his favorite chair that he always sat in? Remember how he always scrunched up his eyebrows when he was focusing really hard on something he was reading? This painting shows all those details and tells us a little bit about him as a person. And that is what makes this an amazing portrait. Portrait of Princess P.I. Sherbatova. This is a 1910 painting by Vasily Surikov. The subject is an 18-year-old from a minor Russian noble family. Despite the family's noble status, we actually don't know very much about her at all. Speculation on my part, I don't think that the head covering is a Muslim thing. I think that it's an Orthodox Christian thing. The most we know about this family, though, was that they were patrons of the arts. They commissioned multiple portraits of various family members, including another portrait of this same person the very next year with a different artist. What's interesting is this woman lived all the way until 1966, which, if you know anything about Russian history, she was a member of a noble family during the year 1917. So living for several decades after that, being the descendant of not only kulaks but nobles, certainly says something, and I have to wonder about what her circumstances were that allowed her to survive that. Seville. This is a 1910 painting by Vasily Surikov. Surikov spent a fair bit of time visiting Spain during this decade, and during that time he got back to his old habit of painting watercolor cityscapes. He did several of them during this time. This particular one is of the city of Seville, Spain. This was definitely later on in this artist's career, but from the beginning, he always spent a lot of time doing watercolor landscapes and cityscapes, just things that were around him, things that were right in front of his face during his travels. I think he did these more because he wanted to than for any other reason. And in fact, among them, I think some of his earlier Siberian watercolors and also the watercolor he did of the Colosseum in Rome were among his best work overall. Despite that, though, he is more well known for his historical paintings. He did a lot of oil-on-canvas portraits during the later part of his career, and he's also very famous for huge canvas historical paintings, showing various scenes from Russian history, but that is where the money was. This is where Surikov's heart was. Seville, the Bullfight. This is a 1910 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is a watercolor painting of his. He did this very late in his career, and most of his watercolor paintings can be categorized as either landscapes or cityscapes. This one sort of breaks the mold of that, but I think I know what's going on here. Surikov focused less on painting genres and painting categories, and instead, he just enjoyed painting what he saw directly in front of him at any given time. With his watercolors especially, he did this because he took his watercolors traveling. His watercolor travel paintings, by the way, are very underrated. I appreciate them very much. But oftentimes it was literally just as simple as he sees something interesting or something that catches his eye. He takes out his watercolor painting set and he paints it. And this was true in 1910 when he visited Spain, specifically the city of Seville. And apparently he saw a bullfight while he was there. Tsarevna's Visit of a Nunnery. This is a 1912 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is one of the oil-on-canvas historical paintings that Surikov was most known for, although there are a couple key differences between this one and the rest of his historical paintings. This one does not have a huge canvas like the other ones. It also does not depict one particular historical event. The particular Tsarevna in this painting is not any specific named person. Rather, Tsarevna is a title for the Russian princess. Or just generic, a Russian princess, any Russian princess. Now, there could have been two reasons for a Russian princess to visit a nunnery. The first reason was simply a routine political visit to an important place. The second reason, though, and what he probably wanted this painting to depict, was she was probably visiting this nunnery as a precursor to becoming a nun herself. Look at her face, I don't see a smile there. In fact, she might be a little bit nervous. I don't see smiles on the other faces in the room either. She's probably doing this to prepare for an ecclesiastic and celibate life. Princess Olga meets the body of Prince Igor. This is a 1915 painting by Vasily Surikov. This is a historical painting by Surikov, but not a huge oil-on-canvas one like most of his history paintings are. This one is both tiny and watercolor, as you can probably see from both the texture and the relative lack of detail. The event this depicts was 945 AD. Prince Igor of the Kievan Rus went to exact tribute from a group of people called the Drevlians. This painting shows Princess Olga, his wife, now widow, encountering the body of her husband. The Drevlians, attempting to make peace, would soon after this give her a marriage proposal to one of their nobles. She pretended to be interested. She invited a bunch of them over for a feast. She locked them in a building and then she burned them alive. Now, at the time, both of these monarchs were pagan. But more than a decade after this, in 957 AD, Olga would accept Christianity, and then she was canonized as a saint in many branches of the Orthodox Church.